Kalab na puso, sa dibdib ko'y buhay. Hindi sumusuko, sa hirap matlumbay. Sa mga manlulubi, hindi pasisi. Duyan ang magigiti, hindi papi. Kabuti ay batil, mandan mang taon ng daluyot yanig. Tayo bumabangon, isang puso pa rin, isang alak sa dilim. Iba't iba man ang mga bituin, sa isang kalawakan magniningning. Magkahawak kamay sa lilim ng bukaw na langit, umaawit. Nabaon man sa putik, matapos ang bagyo, lahat magkakapit-bisig, patuloy na sumusulong, isang puso pa rin, isang alak sa dilim. Iba't iba man ang mga bituin, sa isang kalawakan magniningning. Magkahawak kamay sa lilim ng bukaw na langit, umaga pa.
Pilipino sa makabagong panahon.
Greet everybody tuned in today through the Facebook live streaming on the National Quincentennial page, as well as in other national agencies and in other Facebook pages of our partner institutions, the USC Department of Anthropology, Sociology, and History. We also have the USC Cebuana Studies Center. We also have Museo Cebu, Cebu Provincial Museum, as well as the Diani History Center Incorporated. All right, so welcome to the third lecture of Kultura ug Kaagi, the USC Museum webinar series. This event is actually a part of the Philippines 2021 Quincentennial celebrations presented by the USC Museum and the USC Communications Office in collaboration with our very generous sponsor, the National Quincentennial Committee and the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. The inaugural lecture of this series actually has started last August 8th with Dr. John Peterson's presentation on Visayan archaeology. And last August 26th, we had a wonderful presentation with Athasit Sakam. He is the assistant curator of the Southeast Asian Ceramics Museum of Bangkok University. There were interesting narratives that have been discovered and different aesthetics as well as social factors across different time periods are revealed in the ceramics that he actually presented as part of the collection of the Bangkok University Southeast Asian Ceramics Museum. And today, for material culture, we will actually go to historical figures. this time with another exciting lecture with another speaker that will be introduced later on. And so for our program, we will have the lecture proper after the introduction, and then the audience, everybody can actually go on and comment on the thread below this live streaming in order for us to actually accommodate all your questions or your comments addressed to our speaker for this morning. And so, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the director of the USC Museum and the head of the USC Communications Office, Dr. Jobbers Versales, who will also be moderating as well as introducing our very special speaker for today. Sir Jobbers?
I have a signal problem at home, so I hope you will be able to hear me.
Yes, sir.
Am I coming in loud and clear? Okay. The speaker this Okay, I'm back. There seems to be a signal problem here. Our speaker this morning is not a stranger to Cebu. He is an adopted son of Cebu and played basketball here in the 70s to the 80s, from the 70s to the 80s. He first came here as a Peace Corps volunteer, right, Mike? You were here in the late 60s as a Peace Corps volunteer and was based at Cebu State College for a time and taught history at the University of San Carlos, played basketball with Resil Mojares, our national artist. Professional basketball, I mean, university basketball, right? Yeah, but he took his PhD in history from the University of Michigan, MA in Southeast Asian Studies at Ohio University, and his BA in History and Asian Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Currently, he is with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's an associate director there, and he also teaches as an associate professor of faculty at the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mike has written a lot about the Philippines and about Cebu specifically, and these are published books in the US as well as in the Philippines. He is also we were supposed to present a paper in the Philippine Studies Conference in Spain, but we're all grounded, and also in London. This paper, this talk is supposed to be presented, I think, Mike, at University of Alicante in Spain, right? 2 weeks back, if COVID did not happen. So this is first part of a two-part series. So without any further ado, don't ask about basketball because Pilde ang San Carlos UV. They played for San Carlos. He and I think Resil for a time, and Pilde sa UV Lancers. But anyway, kidding aside, I present to you now the famous adopted son of Cebu, Dr. Michael Cullinane. Mike?
Dagan salamat, Jovers. It's great. I'm very happy to be here. I thank everyone who's attending. I'm looking forward to this. This is actually a paper that is huge. Where I'm only going to do part of it today, and I'll explain what part of it as we move forward. But if we look at the front piece here, so the title of the paper is Ang Kaagi sa mga Kaagi, Biographical Journeys Through the History of Cebu, 1521 to 1940. We will not make it to 1940. So the interesting thing here to me is we start with a case study of Lapu-Lapu. The longer paper will take us all the way to Paulino Gullias, who actually was the uncle of Eddie Gullias, who defeated us at UV. So we won't get to that. So if we go to the next slide, number 2, I want to first explain how I'm using the word Kaagi, the Cebuano word. So that I'm taking this, there are lots of definitions of this, but I'm taking mine initially from an older dictionary by Hermosissima and Lopez in 1966, page 97. So he has two ways of defining Kaagi. The one way is it's an account of events or a narrative. So, and that's one way I'm using it. The second way is a past of one's antecedent or record, a background of a person. In this case, we're using it in the context of a biography. So in a sense, the title of this paper, Ang Kaagi sa mga Kaagi, is actually, in a sense, the account or the narrative of events of lives, of individual lives. And that's kind of where it takes off. And this was a paper that it's a very enjoyable project because I spend a great deal of time studying the lives of people. So if we look at the next slide, we'll just see where does it focus. What's the central area? So I've used the Velarde map of 1572, and the paper is going to focus on Cebu and the central Visayas. So largely here we're considering Cebu, Bohol, Siquijor, Oriental Negros, the sort of the western side of Leyte, and Mindanao also, which becomes an area within this zone that's very important from Surigao probably all the way to Dapitan. So this is the area that it's focused, and most of the data and information will come from Cebu. All right, so if we go to the next slide, we'll look at the historical context of all of this. So this is the historical periods for Cebu's history that I have evolved and worked on for very many years. They don't always fit the national narrative, but many of them do. But they do, for me, fit time periods that I think are worth looking at and talking. So they killed one of Legazpi's Spanish officers and measured the Spanish reaction. Would this get them to leave? They didn't leave. Kaanogon, what a pity, they didn't leave. What should we do? They moved somewhere else? The slide disappeared. I lost.
We have to move to Regina, Mike, because my signal is very bad. The slides sometimes disappear. So Regina will take over.
Okay.
We have
Can the rest of you see the slides?
Not yet. Yeah, Regina will share the slides.
I think it might be Chris just joined us. That kind of pushed this. Oh, there's the slides over there.
Can you see it?
Go down, Reg.
They're not like they were before.
You have not opened the slides yet, Reg.
Oh, there's a slide. There's a slide.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah, but yeah, okay, slideshow, yes.
All right.
This is where we were. So this is fine. This is actually where we were. All right, so this is good. We're down at 1567. Tupas is about to make his decision. So Tupas makes his decision. Sorry, go ahead. He betrays Dagami and he cooperates with the Legazpi. All right, so detailed, written out by William Henry Scott. The result then is Dagami was quartered, a lovely Spanish way of ripping your body into 4 parts and then displaying them along the coastline. Tupas's leadership was at the same time recognized. So if we look at the last slide of this, gives us some information about what happens next. There's a little signal. Bingo, there it is. Okay, and I've chosen a Philippine stamp for this one. So the result, if we look at it in another way, Tupas, who has now betrayed his ally or his competitor, his kaparang, right, is that we basically see him now being granted all sorts of authority and privileges by Legazpi. The first thing that Legazpi does is he makes all of the descendants of Tupas Cebuanos, spelled very specifically with a Z. This category of people, Cebuanos, their descendants did not pay any tribute to the Spanish government until 1885 when the Cedula Personal came back into. The other thing that happens is that the community of Filipinos that were commanded by Tupas became the first Pueblo de Indios in Cebu and were assigned to the Augustinians in 1584 to become the first parish. Right. So thus, Spanish rule began, as I'm trying to depict it here, through negotiation, through resistance, and through collaboration. By 1570, collaboration and conversion won the day. Tupas acknowledged the rule of Legazpi's king. Tupas converted and baptized himself. He became baptized as a Christian, and Tupas entered the colonial realm as probably one of the earliest members of the Principalia, or the Principal. And an interesting thing to me then is that it is 328 years later, in 1898. What's interesting is that that village where Tupas, that is San Nicolas, the town of San Nicolas, was at the forefront of the revolution in Cebu against Spain in April of 1898. And it took 328 years for that to happen. Right. The next slide is moving us then to another topic. Okay, we're looking now at this, our second period in the discussion tonight. I'm calling it Conquista y Evangelización. Right? It's a period I'm dating from around 1570 to around 1740, when Spanish rule was consolidated. If we look at just the major indicators of this period, it's increasingly widespread conversions take place all across the Cebu and central Visayas, largely by Spanish missionaries or friars. In this area, of course, the prominent ones were Jesuits, Augustinians, and later Recollects. They established their misiones. The first one, as we noted, in San Nicolas in 1584. This period, we see the gradual dissemination of Spanish political hegemony. We see the gradual dissemination of Spanish civil and canon law. We see colonial territories, or jurisdicciones, being introduced. These to me are really important because they're not important at first, but they're important because they break the Philippines up into jurisdicciones that actually have very great meanings in Spanish law, even in canon law. So we have new things appearing on the map of the Philippines: provincias, pueblos, parroquias, parishes. In 1740, when we want to, if we just take it all the way to the end and we say, look at what happened, we could see the mga Bisaya, the people of this region, what separated them from being mga Malayu or Malays, right? And what it clearly is the Spanish conquest and their conversion to Christianity. So if we look at our first and only case for this period, we can focus on the next slide. All right, I'll leave this slide up and I'll have a few things to say first. By 1600, large numbers of Cebuanos were confronted with a dilemma: how to respond to Spanish rule. Should they resist? Should they flee? Or should they acquiesce? Voices of those undergoing this 170 years of conquest and conversion are rare. We don't get many voices from the people who underwent it. They're found only in obscure memorials where they are largely nameless Indios, right, who either entered the faith, fled to the hills or the interiors, or fought the Spanish to retain their more traditional ways of life. With few exceptions, the Conquista and Evangelización was nonviolent and resulted in the end in the transformation of the Central Visayas. Since the Central Visayas was by the early 1600s excluded from the trans-Pacific galleon trade and even from direct communications with Nueva España or Mexico, the commercial life in this part of the archipelago remained largely unchanged for many, many years. Throughout this period, change was concentrated on religious conversion and the gradual implementation of Hispanic laws and institutions and jurisdicciones. Right? This raises the question: who are remembered from this period? Who are venerated? Among the few Indios to emerge by name and deed were Tamblot and Pedro Calungsod, each representing a different response to Spanish conquest and its essential religious mission. These two responses are remembered in two different ways. One, resistance, is emphasized by Filipino nationalists, and two, conversion, is emphasized by the Filipino Catholic Church. So if we look at the slides before us, we have two people who are looking at, and we're saying lain sa mga tubag. So their response or their answer to colonialism differed. All right, Tamblot, he's a Visayan leader who resisted colonial rule. In 1621 to 22, he rebelled against Spain in Bohol. He resisted the Jesuit efforts to Christianize his community. He took refuge in traditional beliefs. He would be called Diwatahan or pagan. Right? He reported to be a babaylan, a healer who knew the traditional ways, and he had rejected Christianity. So he's one of our people. The other is Pedro Calunsod, a Visayan who converts to Christianity, who practiced Christianity, who joined with Spanish missionaries to go to Guam in the Marianas. And I might add, if you don't know this, that the Marianas were until from 1565, when the Diocese of Cebu was established, the Marianas were incorporated into Cebu, which is largely why most people believe that Pedro Calunsod might actually have been a Cebuano. In 1672, Pedro Calunsod was martyred and became a Christian martyr serving the Spanish friars. If we look at the next slide. So here we have the Spanish colonial state and the Catholic Church penetrating the archipelago. By the 1740s, it's very clear by the 1740s that we have a category that later anthropologists would call lowland Christian Filipinos or lowland Christian Indios or lowland Christian Bisaya had emerged. Christianity prevailed, indigenous spirituality conformed. Most Visayans eventually acquiesced and converted. Or, as Vicente Rafael has argued in his very early book, that the local people contracted Christianity or converted conversion. That's another story that I'm not going to tell right now. So I want to go back to the original story that we're telling about the different responses. So let's go to the next slide. Here, 300 years later, and I have two images that we can see from out. First of all, we don't know how either of these two people really look. So artists can get carried away with how they depict them. Tamblot is 300 years later venerated as an anti-colonial hero, a bayani. His image has been reproduced in Luneta in Manila. You can find the Tamblot statue at the center, right near the monument to Jose Rizal. Pedro Calunsod is venerated as a Filipino Christian saint, a santo. His image is reproduced in churches all over the Philippines, particularly in the Visayas. This is an ironic reality, in a sense, that today Catholic Filipinos worship Saint Pedro Calunsod, while Filipino citizens and nationalists commemorate Tamblot, the babaylan who resisted Spanish rule and Christianity. We can go then to our last period. I've written about this, I've published on this in an article called Time Between Times, and I've talked about this quite a bit. So I'm calling this period, 1740 to 1825, a period of retirada, in a sense, a time between times, a time between the conversion and the reconquest that will take place after 1825. By 1740s then, Spanish rule began, in my opinion, especially focused on Cebu and the Central Visayas, to decline. Indigenous communities, however, at this same time grew and became increasingly more assertive. And that's what I'm trying to get at in this thing. What are some of the major indicators of the Spanish decline in the Visayas? The 1740s and on, Moro raids increased in the whole region. In 1744, the Dagohoy Rebellion took place in Bohol, and Bohol was removed. Parts of Bohol were removed from the Spanish colonial rule. In the 1750s, the Spanish could not sustain a cabildo, an ayuntamiento in Cebu. It wasn't possible, so they abolished their own cabildo for lack of Spaniards. In 1769, the Jesuits, missionaries, were expelled. In the 1770s, the Augustinians had trouble getting friars to come to this area to serve their communities that they had already started. In 1773, the Spanish expelled the non-Christian Chinese from the region. In the 1770s, Spanish colonial rule began to decline. If we look at the next slide, we can see some of the other things we want to talk about this period, see it in a somewhat different way. So by 1750, Spanish colonial government lacked Spaniards. There were very few settlers, Spanish settlers, to run things, and the government was sending fewer and fewer people to run the provincial areas in the Visayas. One scholar described the Visayan Sea at this point in 1760 as a Moro lake, controlled by Muslim people moving through the area for trade and raid. In 1780s, friar missionaries had declined to the point where it was becoming problematic. In 1780, Cebu-born merchants, and here's we're turning a corner in 1780 because we're not to say something different. Cebu-born merchants and priests prospered. So in the midst of this decline, we're saying that Cebu-born merchants, priests, prospered. This was in fact the start of the great Chinese mestizo hegemony that will take place in Cebu after this. In 1780, indigenous communities in the towns and throughout the provinces were rising. Pueblos and parroquias were forming, and people were becoming more assertive. So the argument that I'm trying to make in this section is while Spanish hegemony declined, indigenous communities emerged and became more assertive, with the Christian religion greatly aided and sustained by Cebu-born naturales, Hispanized and Christianized natives. In Cebu City, they were represented by Cebu-born Chinese mestizos and people who were formerly known in the city as naturales. In the countryside, in the municipalities, we have a far more transparent communities of what I'm using the Cebuano term is the people of the towns, mga lungsuranon. And they will become a major part of the story that I hope to tell here, and we can move to our first case. And I'll say a few things first. The discussion of what I'm calling the period of retirada emphasizes two critical spaces in the emerging Spanish colonial milieu. One, the municipalities and parishes, many of which had been established since the 1600s. And two, the city of Cebu, an urban space that emerged slowly over 200 years, but one that by the early 17th century created a municipality and a parish that came to be dominated initially by Chinese and by the late 1700s by Chinese mestizos. As noted, the argument here is that both these spaces, municipalities and the city, developed significant native-born communities that increasingly began to define this ostensibly colonial region of Islas Filipinas. The discussion below will concentrate first on the mga lungsuranon and second on the ciudadanos, or the people of Cebu City. Right, so if we introduce our first topic here, we're looking at two priests, very industrious, Makugihon Praile. Right, after the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1768 to 69, the most important Spanish friars in the central Visayas and northern Mindanao were the Augustinians and the Recoletos. Right, while the regular clergy had declined significantly by the late 1700s, a handful of Augustinians and Recollect priests devoted themselves to retaining their parishes under extreme hardship. The two priests of this period stand out, not only for their dedication to their defined missions, but also to their efforts to lead their parishioners in protecting communities and in developing local economies. In both cases, these friars that we'll be talking about in a second were also at the forefront of early efforts towards the reassertion of Spanish hegemony in the region, particularly towards the end of their lives. And both had major influences on the preservation and maintenance of Christian communities where they were assigned. Significantly, these and a few others like them helped to stimulate the development of new societal category, mga lungsuranon, or what the Spanish would call as vecinos de los pueblos de indios. So if we look at the two priests, we're going to look at two priests kind of energetic, industrialized, or I should say industrious priests, the mga Kugihon Praile. Julian Bermejo, an Augustinian, and Miguel de Jesus, a Recoleto. Bermejo is famous in Cebu, and if you don't, he lived from, the dates are here, He was a native of Alicante in Spain, which is too bad because that's where we would have gone if we'd gone to Ecofil. We could have looked up his grave, or his, maybe a monument to him. He was ordained, as most Augustinians were, at Valladolid. He served in the Philippines from 1797 to 1851. His entire life as an adult was pretty much in the Philippines. He was a major figure in maintaining Augustinians in Cebu during this period. Right, he was the primary cura parico, or parish priest of Boljoon in southeastern Cebu from 1804 to 1881. He was the Augustinian prior in Cebu during the years given there. He was in the early 1800s. He was the priest who took the lead in constructing the anti-Moro defenses that we'll talk a little bit about later. He was a major figure in the revival of Augustinians in Cebu in the 1840s. If we look at the next slide, we'll talk about Martinez, or Miguel de Jesus. Miguel de Jesus was a contemporary of Bermejo. He was a Recoleto. He was a Peninsular Spaniard. He knew Bermejo, and they worked together in many ways. He was a major figure in maintaining the Recollects in the Visayas, particularly after the departure of the Jesuits in 1869. He was the Recollect curate on the island of Bohol in the town of Lobok. He was the Recollect curate for a very long period of time of the largest Recollect parish in Cebu in Danao. Right? He was allied with Bermejo in establishing the defenses along Cebu's east coast. Both of these men were instrumental during the Retirada in sustaining communities and confronting enemies of the church in the region. Both were involved in the 1827 Reconquista of Bohol, and when they went against the mga sumusunod ni Dagohoy, or the followers of Dagohoy, and we'll talk more about that in a while. So if we move to the next one. So here we're going to look at, rather than individuals, we're going to look at one individual and we're going to look at a town. So we're talking here is the mga kaaway sa tinuhoan and comunidad. So the point here is that religious enemies and community enemies, people who are not a part of your community. And the first one here is mga Bolhoonon, the mga lungsuranon of the town of Boljoon. Boljoon was founded in 1695 as an Augustinian pueblo. 80 years later, it was attacked viciously and destroyed by a Moro raid that took place in the late 1770s. Shortly thereafter, not so long, Bermejo shows up and he decides that he's going to establish and launch an anti-Moro defenses on the southeast coast of Cebu. This has been written up. I've written about this, many other things. Dr. Grisales has written about it. So we know that this is a major part of the thing. He built Bantayan Sahari watchtowers, baluartes were constructed. He set up fleets of ships, communication systems. The goal was to protect vulnerable Christian communities from raids. Right? Native leaders, and this is the part of the story that I'm trying to get at more than anything else. Native leaders, principales, and their communities were very active in these endeavors. Without them, nothing would have actually happened. They could have just run to the hills. They didn't. They stayed and they fought, and we begin to see them as we move forward in this story. And they began increasingly to meet Moros at the sea, not wait for them to attack. So if we look at the picture on your right, this is the Bay of Boljoon, right? And we can see it and we can look at that. And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about what happens in bringing in the other part of our story. Here we have Orandin. We have no idea if this is his real name, but it's a name that appears about him as the Pangulo sa mga Moro that are being fought by the Bolhoonon during this period in the 1810s. The only thing that we really know about him is that he was a Moro and that he died in 1812. That we know. In the 1810s, he was known to the local people by name. And in the Bolhoonon narratives of this time, his name appears. In 1812, he led a raiding party against the town of Boljoon in that southeastern area of Cebu, and he was defeated by the Lungsuranon who came off the shore and met him at sea. They chopped off his head and they brought that head on their mast back to Bolhon to display. The Christian residents of this community then celebrated their victory over Islam. Moros, in their mind, were challenging the emerging way of life in the Visayas. Resistance to them was confirming local identities. The result of these were that the communities began to assert their difference. We are Christians, they are Moros, and they are our enemies. Right, if we conclude this, we can say that for over 200 years, Christian communities in the central Visayas had taken shape unevenly, largely depending on the presence and commitment of Spanish missionaries. Nevertheless, by 1810s, it is safe to conclude that the mga lungsuranon sa Cebu were purong Kristiyanon. They were all Christians. Their difference from other Malays was increasingly internalized during what I am calling the Retirada, when Muslim traders and raiders arrived on their shores to kill, capture, or ransom them and their Spanish priests. Their enemies were not the ang mga Katsila at this point. They were Iranon, Tausug, and Maranao. This realization contributed directly to an expanded community solidarity. By this time, their enemies in theater and in deed were Muslims, Piratas Moros. Right? There's an interesting note here that I like to point out is in the 1880s and 90s, Jose Rizal and other members of the Gente Ilustrado came to understand that it was the Spanish conquest that removed Filipinos from their pre-1565 roots. And though they continued to embrace Christianity, many of these men lamented the fact that they had been separated from their Austronesian ancestors by Spanish rule. We go to the next account. Well, I will sip a little tubig. Okay, well, starting off here with looking at another way to see this, and this is a way that I've also written about in this same thing, and it's one. So we're going to look at mga kaaway sa klase ug kahimtan, sort of class and kind of situation, or the way you are. As distinct communities emerged by the early 1800s, particularly along the eastern coastal municipalities of Cebu, the parishes of the Augustinians in the southeast, and the Recollects in the northeast. It was clear that these communities had developed differently from the urban area of Cebu City. From the late 1700s to the early 1800s, a distinct community of urban-based entrepreneurs, almost entirely Chinese mestizos, had emerged in close association with the limited numbers of Spanish officials assigned to this colonial backwater. As their wealth grew through their success in inter-island trade focused on provisioning the capital and its adjacent communities, their command of the political economy led them to expand their investments in agricultural communities in proximity to Cebu City. Interestingly, they began to impose their will on these areas in search of profitable ventures. At the same time, the mga lungsuranon developed a solidarity with their Spanish priests, developed a strong solidarity to protect their communities, not only from Moros, Remontados, Monteses, but also from Chinese mestizos from Cebu City. In 1814 to 1815, a crisis emerged as mga lungsuranon of southeastern Cebu, allied with their priests, their Augustinian priest, Fray Bermejo, and threatened a rebellion against the Spanish mestizo entrepreneurs and their allies, the Spanish governor or alcalde mayor. All right, so if we look here at the slides, we're defining two areas that are emerging now. One of them, the lungsuranon, we've already looked at, that they're in the towns. The other is the city. And if we look at, we're saying that mestizo ascendancy in the city developed between 1740s and the 1830s. All right, the situation of urban economic interest penetrating into the municipalities at 1815 led to a sublevacion and tumulto, which in Cebuano is largely used gubut or kagubut. In this case, we have two characters that we want to look at. One is Blas Crisostimo. He will use the family name after 1849 of Valle, and he died in 1836. He was a resident of the Parian of Cebu, wealthy, powerful Chinese mestizo.
In the 1810s, with others, he sought grazing lands in the southeastern part of Cebu. He allied his effort with the Spanish provincial governor, probably his partner in the adventure. Who were his friends? Mga kauban ni Blas. Who were his friends? Mga kaaway ni Blas. Right? Blas's friends were powerful and ambitious Chinese mestizos of the Parian. His kaaway, his enemies, were Spanish Augustinians and Cebuano Lungsurano. If we go to the next slide. The other character in this story is a man who emerges in the historical record as Juan Jong, right, a resident of Tinaan, at the time a part of the parish of San Nicolas, today part of the parish of Naga. Right. In the early 1800s, he emerged as a municipal official, experienced in the anti-moral fights that had been set up in that part of Cebu. He was familiar with this. In 1815, he led a revolt to defend his municipal lands from the Chinese mestizos of Cebu. He allied with the Spanish Augustinian friar, Bermejo. So who were his kauban and who were his kaaway? Right. His kauban were the municipal elites consolidating their local identities in their town. His kaaway were the Chinese mestizos of Cebu and the Spanish provincial government. So what happens in this thing and how do we interpret this thing? And let's go to the next series of slides. So the result is gubud. Right? But this gubud, which we could just say trouble or tumulto, had no battle. It had a peaceful resolution, and the mestizos went elsewhere. The mestizos didn't give up on their mission. They just moved to another place. Both the provincial governor of Cebu at the time and Fray Bermejo were investigated by the Spanish forces at the time. As far as we can tell, neither of them was punished, but both of them had been involved in one way or another in the tumulto. The 1815 uprising was clearly, if we look at it this way, neither anti-Spanish nor nationalistic. By 1820, the reality was an emerging native diversity and stratification that's beginning to increase during this period. A consolidation of the jurisdictional identities that had been introduced by the Spanish 2 centuries earlier. So we begin to now see meaning to some of these things. Cebu City can now describe people who are ciudadano. There are also people in the city who are parianon. There are people in Cebu City who are mestizo sangle. The city is also the headquarters for the gobierno, the people who run the government. The province is where the Lungsuranon live, but the Lungsuranon don't just live in the province. They can be San Nicolasnon from the town of San Nicolas, Argohanon from the town of Argao, Dalagitnon from the town of Dalagete, and of course Bolhoonon from the town of Bolho. Even at this time, we begin to see more references to regional identities, that the entire region of the Central Visayas can be made up of mga Sugbuanon, or they can now, the word Bisaya becomes more used during this period than it had been before. All right, we move to another topic. So we're going to look now at what happened with Dagohoy and how this fits into the story. All right. In the same context as the last case, community identity was asserted by the mga Lungsuranon of Cebu's municipalities in regard to their sentiments about other Indios living outside the Spanish jurisdiction. The most obvious manifestation of this sentiment was the participation of mga Lungsuranon, all Christians, in efforts to incorporate Monteses or remontados, those who lived beyond Spanish or municipal authority, and they needed to be reintegrated into sanctioned communities, into these jurisdicciones. The residents of the towns, the vecinos de los pueblos, or what we may be viewed at this point, as I've been calling mga Lungsuranon, viewed those who were not bajo de campana, the people who were not under the bell, as outsiders, those who needed to be integrated within the communities, especially those who were still diwatahan, animists or pagans, those who were not part of their professed Christian communities. The most dramatic moment in this situation in the Central Visayas was in the late 1820s when the Spanish authorities decided to reincorporate the followers of Dagohoy, who had revolted in 1744, into Christian communities. In this endeavor, between 1827 and 1828, the mga Lungsuranon of Cebu's east coastern towns enthusiastically participated in this Reconquista, or what the Spanish Governor General at the time, who participated in this mission, called La Reducción de Bohol. Right. What is instructive about this designation is that it reveals that an important reducción took place almost 250 years after the establishment of the so-called Spanish hegemony. So if we look here at the two groups that we're looking at, the mga kaaway sa tinuhoan and kahimtan, the mga sumusunod ni Francisco de Dagohoy. Dagohoy's rebellion took place in 1744 and was a successful rebellion. It rejected Spanish and Jesuit hegemony, similar to Tamblot more than 100 years earlier. It created an alternative community in the retirada. It was towards the beginning of it. In 1828, when it's crushed, right, it also, for me, symbolizes the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the Reconquista and the end of the retirada. In 1744 to 1828, Central Bohol was removed from Spanish Philippines. Though Dagohoy is likely to have died and was not present when they attacked her, his followers persevered. So let's look at the other group on the slide. So the other group is mga sumusunod ni Pedro Cabanlit. Who is Pedro Cabanlit? Right? He's not somebody who would be widely known, even in Cebu. But what he was a major leader or principal and ex-gobernadorcillo of Bolhoon, the very town we talked about before. He was a distinctive member in what I'm trying to draw as the new generation of mga Lungsuranon. He had fought against the Moros as a local leader where he gained fame. He was committed to his Christian community. So in 1827, the Spaniards decide to reconquer Bohol with their Reconquista or their Reducción. Bohol at the time was part of Cebu province. The Spanish military expedition was actually organized by Mariano Ricafort, the Governor General of the Philippines. The Augustinians and the Recollects of Cebu joined the military assault and actually fought. But we also find large numbers of Christian Lungsuranon who joined the Spaniards. The goal? To defeat the Remontados and the Monteses, the pagans, and return them to Spanish rule. The next slide, we see a little bit more about what happened. So in 1827 and through into 1828, Pedro Cabanlit was a major leader of the Reconquista of Bohol. He commanded forces that were recruited from the towns of southeastern Cebu. Cabanlit was praised by name by the Governor General, Mariano Ricafort, who glorified this military expedition, as I mentioned, as the Reducción de Bohol. A copy of the book is in the illustration at the right. So this again was a reducción that took place in the early part of the 19th century. Cabanlit himself was one of the few Cebuanos who was actually named formally in these Spanish records. So the Christian Lungsuranon, led by an ex-gobernadorcillo, Pedro Cabanlit, prevailed, and the mga Diwatahan and the Remontado were subdued and reintegrated into Christian parishes at the end of the 1820s. And I'd like to end with a kind of an ironic note here of a reality. In 1956, the municipality and parish named Dagohoy was erected in central Bohol, in fact, in the very area that Dagohoy had once commanded over. It was done so to commemorate Dagohoy as a Filipino hero. The people of this parish profess their devotion annually to Our Lady of Lourdes, the Lourdes, their Catholic patron. We might ask that what might Dagohoy have thought about having the place of his rebellion become a happy Christian community when all is said and done. Right, we can go to the next slide, series of slides. So reminder here that we're basically talking about the period of the retirada. And so what I'm looking at now, and we're going to move to the city. So we're switching to the city. We've had some things to say about the towns and the Lungsarano. Now we're going to move into the city and see what an array of people are emerging in this city that will become a major part of the city for right up to the present. They're all there already, most of them. So we're talking about this as Karaang mga Criollo sa Ciudad, Españoles Filipinos, three of them. Mariano Raffles, Andres Duterte, and yes, he is related to the president of the Philippines, and Ignacio Cabrera. And what we're going to do then is I'm going to say a few things about it, and then I think we can briefly look at these people rather than to do detailed stuff. I will apologize in advance, I think, to those listeners who are less familiar with Cebu, since most of the families mentioned here are those that are likely to be recognized in Cebu, but may not be familiar to others outside Cebu. The first group of Ciudadanos that we'll discuss here are those for whom the center of Cebu City was intended by Legazpi. When Legazpi built Cebu City, he set in the middle of it called the Spanish Quarter, or what he actually referred to as intramuros, even though they never built walls anywhere. Walls were never constructed, but still the inner part of the city was known as intramuros. This is where the Spaniards were supposed to live. It is also the place where we get the building of Fort San Pedro, the Convento de Santo Niño of the Augustinians, the cathedral, the Casa Gobierno, and later, after 1595, the Bishop's Palace. This is where the original Cabildo de Cebu was located until it was abolished in 1750s. And even though Spanish settlement in this place was relatively sparse for over 300 years, a small number of Spaniards took up residence, and even a smaller number served as officials of the Cabildo, which, as I noted, was abolished in the middle of the 18th century. During the Retirada, the Cebuanos discussed here are represented as a part of a Creole community of Cebu City. As we know, during the same period, there was quite a substantial Creole community in Manila. Here it was very small. While it is uncertain that any of these Creoles in this segment were from original Spanish settlers, we do know that their numbers were small. Perhaps there were 10 individuals by 1800. In addition to those professed Creoles, there were another 20 to 30 Spanish mestizos also residing in this part of Cebu City at the time. All three of the people dealt with here, those are highlighted, were born in Cebu, making it possible for their immediate ancestors that could likely have come from some of the members of the former defunct Cabildo, but we don't really know, and we haven't been able to make the connections. While none of these men possessed the resources of many of the Chinese mestizos of the Parian, they retained a Spanish status that empowered them within the largely nominal colonial bureaucracy existing in the early decades of the 19th century. These racially defined posts sustained them and facilitated several of their members and their families to retain their prestige and position within the urban social milieu. All three of the men here come from this category. And if we look at the first one we're looking at here, and I might add that one of the things that distinguishes them as Creoles, and even to some extent Spanish mestizos, is that this is in the early part of the 1800s, they are using apellidos, right? They are using their original Spanish names, and they're the only ones pretty much in the entire city of Cebu at this time that are doing so. So our first character, Mariano Vicente Raffles, if you are familiar with Cebu, you know that the Raffles family has had a major impact on various developments throughout Cebu. I won't go into details because we'll run out of time. We can look at the next person who might be of interest to people. Oh, Andres Duterte died in 1846. His direct connection to the current president is not clear, but there's no doubt that it is a connection. So he's he's the origin of the Duterte family in Cebu, of the ones who we can discover. He served in the 1830s as the Alferez de la Ciudad de Cebu. He was the flag bearer for the city in formal events. He was a property owner in central Cebu in the area of San Roque, and he had many distinguished relatives who came from him and from his siblings. I'm guessing that he's probably the great grandfather of Rodrigo Duterte. All right. The next one is Ignacio Manuel Cabrera Irnaez. Here the family is largely remembered as the Cabrera family, and we can see his dates. He was a very distinguished person at the very beginning of the 19th century, a major property owner in Cebu City, related to people who became priests, such as Matias Lucero Cabrera of Argao. He was the uncle of Januaria Cabrera y Lucero, who was the wife of Victoriano Osmeña. So he's very well connected at this time. And if we summarize these three and look at them as representatives of this early Creole community, there are several other Creole families that we could have included here. Just to name some of them, La Sala, Rosales, Rosada, De La Serna, and Fortic, and others. Right? These are all going to be families that by the middle to the late 19th century had moved out into other locations, some of them staying in Cebu City, but all over the central Visayas and northern Mindanao. So if we look at our next group, mga Insik sa Karaan Parian. So we're looking at two distinguished people here, and I'll have a few things. So at the start of the 1800s, the most dominant community within the jurisdiction of Cebu City was the Parian, a municipality and parish established in 1614 by the Spanish state and the Catholic Diocese of Cebu. While the larger parish, Parian Lutaos was what it was called, was initially viewed as a Chinese and native district in the city's extramuros, in other words, outside the walls, but on the periphery of the intramuros, it was by the middle of the 1700s an urban community that possessed the most affluent residents of the Ciudad de Santísimo Nombre de Jesus. Most of the prominent Chinese mestizos of the Parian at the end of the 18th century were already mestizos by the time we get that period started and by the time we get to know them. In 1773, some 50 non-Christian Chinese were expelled from Cebu and from the Philippines. After this expulsion, the only Chinese permitted to reside in Cebu City were those who were already Chinos Cristianos, right? Chinese who had been baptized as Christians. By the end of the 18th century, less than a dozen of these individuals can be identified, while the Parian at the same time was already home to over 1,000 Chinese mestizos. For the large majority of Cebu's early 19th century Chinese mestizos community, their Chinese ancestors are not known. So when we find the names that we'll see in the next group of these Chinese mestizos, they're already Chinese mestizos by the time they enter the records that we're looking at, and we are unable to find their Chinese ancestors for the most part. Some people have made these up, and it's kind of interesting. Both these prominent Chinos Cristianos lived out their lives, the two that we're going to discuss here, lived out their lives in Cebu. They never returned to China. They intermarried with local residents, and they launched two of Cebu City's most prominent families of the 19th century, the Gandioncos and the Gontuancos. So the first one we're looking at here is Domingo Gandionco. And I won't go into all of this. And if anyone is interested, you get my email. I love to talk about these. So I think we need to move on. If we look at the next one, we see Silvestre Gantuanco. It's pretty clear in the Gantuanco family histories that Silvestre is considered to be their ancestor, the founder of the thing. It became the surname, and there are many, many prominent people of this area who emerged from this family. So what these two are then is they are Chinese. They were born in China and they came and lived in the Parian. And what we're seeing them now is they lived through this period that even though they interacted and lived in the Parian, they were all through their lives considered Chinos Cristianos. They were never considered Chinese mestizos, but all their children were. And there's a large number of those became very prominent. These two vecinos del Parian were the most prominent Chinese residents of Cebu City in the late 1770s, right on up to the 1830s. And if some of their children became, and it's very clear to me that by the end of Spanish rule, the Gandioncos and the Gantuancos had emerged as prominent Cebuanos, all of whom made an easy transition to becoming Filipinos when Spanish rule ended. Right. The next group that we can look at are a whole lot of people. I have laid them all out, and I'm calling them the unang mga dagkong mestizo sangre, so the early big or powerful, if you will, Spanish or Chinese mestizos. I've listed their names in here, and if you'll notice that none of them, as we discover them in the record, none of them have the family names that will later become associated with their families. Right? And I want to say a little bit about them. Between the 1770s and the 1840s, the richest and most powerful residents of Cebu City were all members of Chinese mestizo families of Parian, most of whom profited from the limited but lucrative inter-island trade and from the provisioning of Cebu City and its environs largely as shopkeepers and urban property owners. It was not only their wealth, however, and this is a point I want to make clearly for them because this is during the retirada that they're emerging. It is not only their wealth that they all played critical roles in maintaining Spanish civil and ecclesiastical institutions in the city, province, and region. Sadly, we don't know who their Chinese ancestors were, and that the 8 of them that we've chosen here, they stand out during this period, with all of them having been leading officials or principales of the Parian and fully engaged in the commercial and administrative life of Cebu and the Visayas. Each of the 8 was born in the late 18th century and emerged in the early 19th century as affluent and influential urban residents, increasingly with land acquisitions in both Cebu province and elsewhere in the central Visayas. Our earlier character, Blas Crisosimo, is a part of this group, the one who had the altercation with Juan Jiong. Among these 8 prominent Chinese mestizos, only 2 of them, Sanson and Regis, actually used apellidos before 1849. All the others took their apellidos after Governor General Narciso Claveria's decree in 1849, when almost all Cebuanos, including other Filipinos. So let's just go through these slides without really getting into it, but look at the names, right? So that we're looking at 8 Chinese mestizos who are very prominent during this period. And if we pick up on their names, some of you will recognize these names as being very important families in Cebu right to the present. And I'll emphasize here, the thing to look for here is not just that they were principales of the Parian. That's almost a no-brainer. What's interesting here is the role they played in the church. They were priests, the role they played in the government. So if we look at Cipriano Nepomuceno Gonzaga Reyes right away at the beginning, if we slide down, we see that he was the Escribano Público of Cebu in 1813. This is rather remarkable. This is a native-born Chinese mestizo, very wealthy, holding a major position in the Spanish colonial government. We can also see that his older brother, Juan Reyes de San Juan, was a very prominent presbítero or Catholic priest during this period. So these are people who are not just wealthy, not just engaged in trade, but also engaged in education, in government, and in the ecclesiastical services of the church. Let's look at some of the others then, and focus then, if you will, as you go through them, to look at some of the tasks that they had. Hilario Jose de Sanson died in 1836. Right, we can see that his son became Escribano Público de Cebu. He himself was the contratista de gallos. He was the one who ran the cockfighting businesses throughout Cebu. He was a merchant. His grandson was Valeriano Sanson, who was also Escribano Público of Cebu. And what I've done at the bottom of each of these, in case anyone is interested later, that I've given the families that these people have also intermarried with over time, just to show their position. We can go to the next one. So here's one that might be familiar to people. This is the oldest member that we have found in the records of the Osmeña family, Alejandro Baltasar. He died in 1840 as Alejandro Baltasar. He never really ever had the name Osmeña attached to him. He's the great-grandfather of Sergio Osmeña Sr. Right. He was the grandfather of Tomas Osmeña, and people who played huge roles in Cebu during this time. And he's the one then we can argue was the founder, the oldest known member of the Osmeña family in Cebu. We go to the next one. Simeon Josef Garces. Garces is, of course, those of you who know Cebu, is a very prominent family in Cebu. We can see that not only this, he was related to priests, he was a major principal, they were a wealthy family. He's even the grandfather of Juan Gorordo, the first native-born bishop of Cebu, and he's a very well-connected person. If we move on to Lino Nepomuceno, we can go to the next, is Espina. So he's a member of the Espina family in Cebu. His primary relative coming down the line is he was the uncle of Mariano Espina, who was the father of Segundo, of many, many people, not Segundo, and intermarried into many families. And he was also the father of Clemente Espina, who was a presbytero and the rector of the seminary for quite a period of time, the Seminario de San Carlos in Cebu. Go to the next one. Jobers will like the next one, Gabino Rosales, who also died in 1840 and actually never probably used the name Renes, but he's from the Renes family and was the most prominent founding member of that family as far back as we can go. He was also the business partner of Blas Crisostimo, who had the altercation with Juan Jong. Right, so there are many. He's also, as you can see, also on another side of the family, the grandfather of Bishop Gorordo. Right, so we can go on to the next one. I put this one at the end, but this is probably one of the most dominant Chinese mestizo families of the entire group, the Velosos. Right, and as far as we know, there's two major lines of the Velosos, and I've written quite a bit about this. And this is the line that becomes the most prominent over time, is the line that came from Josef Isidoro, who died also in 1940, again, 1840. Again, when he died, he probably never had the name Veloso. But if we look down the list, he's the grandfather of Gabino Veloso, who was according to the Spanish at the time in the 1870s and 1880s, was by far the richest man in Cebu. Right, and he has many other relatives. Last one we can go to is one that actually originates through a female, and this was an illegitimate relationship, but this illegitimate relationship gave rise to the Singson family as far back as we can trace it in the records. Juana Catalina, right, who died in 1841, never actually used the name Singson, but her relatives were given that name after her death, and she was related to a famous priest. She herself married a Chino Cristiano, Pedro Valerio Silionco. Her son and the adopted son of her late husband was Mariano Singson, who gave birth to Segundo Singson, who was probably one of the most prominent people in the 1890s in Cebu and a major landowner in the northern part of Cebu. So to conclude this group of people, we could say that the critical observation here is the early generation of Chinese mestizos of the Parian created an endogamous community that did not move out of this community for the most part until the 1850s. So this is a community, these people were all that we've just looked at, were raised in the Parian, stayed in the Parian, and didn't begin to move out until their church was abolished in 1849, and everything changed after that. So the next group of people that we're looking at are people who lived in Cebu City, and I'll try to summarize this one and make it go quicker. These are major families of Cebu City, but their families are not connected to the Creoles, or the Spanish mestizos, or to the Chinese mestizos. So in some ways, these are the natives of Cebu. And when you divide them up and look at them very carefully, this group of people after 1849 came into becoming natives who became known as naturales. And they formed the Gremio de Naturales, but they came from two different parts of the city. Some of them came from Tagaciudad, which we're naming here from the Intramuros, and others were from Tagalutaos, the part of the city that was once under the Parian. And if we just look through this group of people to kind of see the diversity of this, we'll look at three very quickly who are Tagaciudad, Nepomuceno, who took the name Normandia, which is a prominent name in Cebu, and we can go to the next one. Naharro, right? Teodoro de los Santos ended up taking the name of Naharro, one of the oldest members of the Naharro family in Cebu. If we go to the next one, you get an extremely prominent family, certainly by the end of the 1890s and into the early part of the 20th century, is the Ralios family, right, which was founded by Andres Victoriano. Probably one of the most important figures in this is his grandson, Florentino Ralios y Cuico, 1854, who was a major empleado of the Spanish government and the first Cebuano president of Cebu City from 1901 to 1903. If we then look at the next two and the last two in our story here, we're calling them Tagalutaos. So these are people who did not come from the Intramuros. They came from an area in the Extramuros outside the city and were once connected to the Parian, but then broken in 1849. So if we look at picking two representatives from here, Melencio Siriaco, who later took the family name Peñalosa, which is a prominent name here and was a major figure in the city of Cebu later on. And then the last one we can click on is Agustin Josef, who took the family name. He's also Tagalutaos, the oldest member of the Vestil family, who gave the son in the 1870s to 90s as Nazario Vestil. Right. So to conclude, I think we'll go to the last group of people that we'll be looking at, and I'm sorry that it takes so long to get there. And this is priests. So what I want to say here first is that while most histories of the Philippines stress the dominance of Spanish friars and the subservience of Filipino secular clergymen, this was not the case in Cebu during the Retirada. During the Retirada from the 1740s to 1829 and even after, the Spanish secular bishops ran the diocese of Cebu. Most of them were Creoles. They weren't peninsular Spaniards. Most of them promoted the indigenous clergy. So you have bishops of Cebu during this period of nearly 100 years that are promoting locally born people into the clergy. Though relatively few in numbers, when we look at their numbers at large, these native-born priests, or presbyteros, played seminal roles in the managing of parishes and the diocese of Cebu during their lifetimes. Of the four most important parishes in the vicinity of the urban area of Cebu, three of them were dominated by secular curates: the Parian, the Cathedral, and the Mandawi. And the fourth, of course, was the Augustinian parish of San Nicolas, which was dominated by a friar. From the late 18th century until well into the 19th century, these and other native clergymen represented and protected the interests of the church institutions at the highest level of ecclesiastical hierarchy in this diocese. So we're looking at the first one here is probably the most dominant priest of the late 18th into the early 19th century, Pedro San Rafael y Vasquez. We have no idea what his family name was. He was clearly a Chinese mestizo, a powerful member. He studied at the University of Santo Tomas, where he got a bachelor in sacred theology. He became, almost upon his immediate return to Cebu, he became the cura parico of the Parian Lutaos parish. The Bishop of Cebu, the Spaniard in 1829, waited for his death before he began to attack the Parian, and eventually within 20 years was able to abolish the Parian parish forever. But Father Pedro here was quite a vigorous protector of the parish. He also owned considerable land. He was an active provisor of the Diocese of Cebu. When there were vacancies in the bishops who had died and the new bishop hadn't come, he actually ran the Diocese of Cebu. And when he died in 1829, the Parian Lutaos parish lost its protector. We look at the next one, and we only have two more. A Philippine-born, we think he was Cebu-born, not certain. But in the 1820s, he became the vice rector of Cebu's diocesan seminary. He was the cura parroco at a critical moment during the parish. He was banished to Manila, but he played a huge and of taking charge of the most important parish in the city of Cebu, which is by secular clergy. The last one Ambrosio, who in Leyte. In 1813, he was selected. And this is a complete constitution arrived in Cebu, and they needed to pick a delegado to go to the Spanish Cortes. So at this moment, there were a few Creole that here was a Filipino secular priest, central 1808 to 45. He was the cura of Mandawi. The bishop wanted to turn Mandawi over of Mandawi. The bishop of Cebu, a Spaniard, finally engaged and turned the diocese of Mandawi over to the Recoletos, in that changes. That is the beginning. Is what I'm calling is the Reconquista. To contact me, I certainly welcome contact and interaction.
You just the green part. There's stop. We apologize for the signal problem. We seem to have a signal problem here in Manila. The Zoom is like my Zoom here. You're actually coming loud and clear on Zoom, but apparently on Facebook Live, it's a bit. Once again, he said you have to.
Should I do it tonight?
Maybe next year we can do this one. I think we still have time for
even do it in person.
Yep, that's possible because you have to come here again. You have to. Where's your huge?
It's in my sala. Walk in my house, you see it immediately. It's the first thing you see.
Oh, okay. Now,
but I do want to say why I don't want to do it like tonight again. This miserable.
Oh. Anyway, Mike, where did you get all these lists? But for those who are not in the know,
as you know, but I started out at the Philippine National Archives, right? The Philippine National Archives is an unbelievable collection of Spanish era documents. The collection that I use the most, land documents, all of these are documented for Cebu from 1818 is when you get the earliest ones, all the way up to 1905, and you can find others that go after that as well. And so the archives is it's a beautiful repository of stuff. It takes time. Some of this has been digitized, and I think that's the thing that has to happen next, is that all of these records need to be carefully digitized and made available to people anywhere. But I actually spent a huge amount of time in two places reading these records. One is at Luneta, and the other was in a Mormon reading room because the Church of the Latter-day Saints has filmed lahat. It's like they're all there, and you can't always get them, and they're not easily accessible. Right. The other place where I spent a great deal of time is in the over 50 parishes of Cebu province. Taking my old motorcycle and tooting my way around Cebu province from parish to parish to parish and saying, "Father, do you have any old records?" They have lots of them. It's like, and if you go into these parish archives, you can spend weeks and months going through their records with finding fortunes of things. The other, considerable with
Mandirigmang Pilipinas.